Hello, this is the last session of the museum's cultural organizations and social impact. Uh, I'm just first want to say how happy I am to have you all part of this. This is an inaugural and a kind of pilot of a topic that has concerned me for my whole career, and it's been great to explore these questions with you. Um, it's uh, an opportunity today for me to discuss your project proposals. Um, no proposal at this point is complete, but actually, I think it's helpful to have this conversation about your initial proposals. I realize that we live in a society, whether we're talking about a class that has a final project and grades, or we're talking about a museum that has a program with panelists, and that we tend to um, put a lot of emphasis on product and being finished. And I think it's actually useful, and I didn't really intend this, that we're talking about your process and that these ideas are in process and that your final projects will be in process. These are ideas. And I'd like you to keep that spirit of process in mind, that too often I think cultural institutions, um, whether we're talking about a university, NYU, or we're talking about a museum, and the emphasis on product um, uh, excludes some sort of explorations and experiments and even the possibility of failure or trial and error that I don't want to be party to in overemphasizing finished product for you. So um, so take these comments not as things that you must incorporate or you get it wrong, but rather because you're all working separately, all four of you, that it's an opportunity to think through how some of the comments and suggestions I'm going to make about other projects inform your own. And actually, really, I'm not particularly even making suggestions. I think what I'd like to talk about is some issues that arise from the proposals you've made that I think inform the broader conversation I've been trying to have and will inform all of you. So really, this is less of a critique than an exchange of ideas and process. And so we'll start with Wessam, and I apologize, Wessam, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I haven't heard you say it. Um, I'm really actually intrigued as much by a post that you made to the forum as I am by your project. I mean, I think they inform each other, and in many ways, I think your project begins to answer some of the questions you raised. But I'd like to actually focus on those questions, and it'll be interesting to see how you answer them. So Wessam has been his proposal is to create a training institute, I think connected to the Doha Film Institute, but the forum post really addressed specifically that institute. And I thought it was interesting, and actually I'm going to draw Amy's project for the Phoenix Art Museum into conversation here, as it got to really asking some questions about what we mean by grassroots as opposed to top-down, and actually putting the local in the context of the global. And I think that for me, raised some really interesting questions because how we define what's local can be important, but it can also be limiting. And whether you're talking about perhaps a conservative community, whether they be in the American South, or I can imagine there are certain conservative communities in the Mideast, or traditions that we might not find if we're talking about social change to be progressive. So it's interesting who gets to define that, the agenda, right? And there's certain ideas that might be more progressive, or we might think to be more towards what we think about as social justice, that in a particular locality, in a particular community, if we drew a circle around it, would be in the minority, would not be something embraced by a polity, by certain local press. And what would the cultural institution's role, say, to respond to a minority or respond to a community that's not? Actually, we can draw into Laura's context. So, Syrian immigrant community arriving to Germany doesn't have power, and how would they assert themselves against institutions which are typically responding to the local? So I think as we live in a global world, and the whole idea of community is really complicated. I think what's interesting for cultural institutions is balancing the possibility of exchange across boundaries, bringing in ideas from, in Wassam's case, a region of Middle East filmmakers. I actually had a friend who had worked for the Ford Foundation, and one of the things they did was to fund the Middle East North Africa region and to elevate voices that Ford, of course, is being funded from New York. So voices in the region that might not have local support to give them a global platform and an opportunity. And so how, if the Ford was to reach out locally, you could say, well, Ford is top down, they're in New York. If they were being responsive to, say, funding decisions locally, could that possibly change what they funded? I'm going to make an exaggerated example. If they, we know that certain parts of the, well, I'm actually not going to make that. I think the point is, that none of these situations is simple. And what I hope is that that reading these case studies gives you some thoughtful ways of navigating the complexities of how the local and global intersect, and how some of the concerns that, say, experts for quality, experts now in a museum environment who might travel across global institutions, setting agendas that are considered to be global agendas, or setting context for what is quality. How do they sit against the local and whatever that might be, and recognizing that often the way that experts set those boundaries conflicts with how some communities might have the standards that they might, or the values that they might hold dear. And we can see that, actually going back to the Kerry James Marshall, and that there are certain cultural aesthetics or values or subject matter that for a long time was not considered worthy of inclusion. So there's a push and pull here, and it's I think then to go to process, like if the concern becomes the process and who's at the table, then we push these things together, I suppose. So I like with this Doha Film Institute that if the elites that we might assume from a press, the media is probably portraying, oh, there's these elites and they're bringing all these people from outside the country, and what about our filmmakers? So how does the Training Institute address those concerns? How does the Training Institute perhaps put some of the regional filmmakers in dialogue locally to create a different kind of conversation? And one can also recognize that politicians and press can be interested in inflaming issues or pointing fingers, and and a culture institution, I think, has a different kind of position in its relation to the political world, to the economic world, and can be a site to create balance. So one can imagine that this training institute addresses some of the economic concerns, brings local traditional views into dialogue with globals, and maybe in the process changes both sides, actually. So it's not always top down, that the teacher is the expert and the local is receiving this great knowledge and in some sort of mode of what's the word I'm looking for? Well, kind of didactic model. That there's some exchange that goes on, even that the teacher gets from being in Doha and interacting with a local population that they're training. So perhaps the training goes both ways in some way. Same sort of questions. I think for me the challenge of all the proposals is inherent in doing this kind of work. There's nothing about your approach or your proposals that's challenging. It's challenging to do this kind of work, and I guess I'm hoping to emphasize some of the challenge, and I hope that you, as you write, that you're cognizant of how challenging all this is, and perhaps I hope and I expect that I will learn something from the way that you all embrace these challenges. So with Karen, the speakeasy, this idea of bringing African American culture into the museum, very much inspired by the first reading about Kerry James Marshall, creating a fluid space, a space for empathy. So the challenge here, I think, is how do we define the conditions of something like a speakeasy? And there's some idealism that I really like about this space that is fluid and empathetic, but I guess I'm going to peel back the layer away from the final product, this imagined perfect utopian speakeasy, to ask, well, who defines it, and who is it for? And how do African Americans whose culture is being represented relate to the creation of the speakeasy? And then maybe conversely, I think there can be an assumption that bringing culture through a museum informs a population who's not aware. So in this case, it might be a white audience. And I guess one of the challenges is, how does the speakeasy inform or bring a white audience, or an audience that's not familiar with African culture, into contact with that culture? But how does, at the same time, how is it interesting to those whose culture it is to have this experience? And I think there are ways for that to happen. But I hope as you do the readings, you might think about this. I think it's in common with Wessams. It's like, what is the reciprocity of what is being proposed? So it's not one-sided. And I don't think that you're proposing something one-sided, Karen. I just hope you'll keep that in mind as you finish your paper. So for Laura, I'm looking at Syrian immigrants in Germany, in Brunswick, Germany. Fantastic opportunity to use a cultural space to break down some of the barriers in a cultural environment, maybe diffuse some of the tensions that might exist between a small town. I don't think Brunswick, Germany, as far as I know, it's not a Berlin. It's not a big city. So I think some really intriguing questions, and I wonder about then for this, like, who sits at the table, and how does even sitting at the table to plan a cultural event inform the event? So again, how does the process inform the product? So we can imagine, there'll be this wonderful table and everyone will get around to have these, to have this discussion. But how do these communities work together to have the discussion? Is it the Syrian community setting the table? And that might be great. Maybe that's what it should be. But how does that, who feels invited from Brunswick? Is it just, the people that already support immigration and already are informed about Syrians. So to what end? And so if there are people who need to be reached, who are antagonistic, how do you get to them? Or is this even possible? So it's again, it's like, how do you a lot of our issues as humans on the planet are about power and territoriality and values, and I think a challenge is, how do we create a process to get to the point where we can sit down and break down these barriers? So I guess this is I've been very idealistic up to now, and I'm interested in actually maintaining my idealism, but I'd like you all, as you write, to think through how one grapples with the kind of inherent paradoxes of creating a table for people to sit around who actually may not feel like they share very much. How do you do that, I guess, as much as the idea that when you do it, some great results will happen. I think that's what I'm trying to get at here. So finally, with Amy, who has been working with the Phoenix Art Museum and the Contemporary Forum of Art and Architecture weekend, really like this idea of incorporating a community board, advisory board, to structure this weekend. And we can imagine that the geography of which parts of Phoenix that it touches expands. And I really liked this reference to, in the past, because this weekend is celebrating Starchitects, and one imagines, you didn't say this, but I imagine that some of the architects that get featured are not local, that you bring in talent. And so who can afford to bring in that talent is certain resident, most cities don't have multiple areas, or if they have multiples, there are distinct localities that have wealth, and those localities tend to draw the resources, and those resources can be global, which then can bring talent, which is why I saw some connections to the Doha, but in a very different way. So in Doha, the global kind of speaks to something progressive, let's say, in terms of the things that we value or ideas. One can imagine that there are Middle Eastern filmmakers making films about women's empowerment, for example. Perhaps, and it's not to disparage Starchitects, but they can get a bad rap for being, kind of tools of big capital. And, Zaha Hadid, who actually just passed away, works in London, is from the Middle East, very criticized for the kind of labor practices at some of her architecture sites. So I'm just going to actually play devil's advocate here. I can imagine that there will be people on the board who feel nervous about including 15 villages and perhaps including some local architects that don't seem to be of great quality in someone's mind, and maybe some of the converse. So in Wessham's case, the local press was criticizing the film festival for bringing this global talent. Perhaps there's a powerful Phoenix architecture critic who's going to say, "Oh, why? Suddenly now we're looking at some local yokel projects that don't deserve this attention, and we're not serving Phoenix well by becoming what's the word I'm looking for? Parochial, right?" So conversely, I can imagine there's some pressure that if you opened up the conversation to do just that, like why isn't Phoenix, maybe the neighborhood press might take this position. Why aren't we celebrating, architects from Phoenix? And now that we're at the table, we're gonna, rant and rave and we don't want any Starchitects. Like, why are they coming? This should be about Phoenix. So I happen to work for a Chicago Architecture Biennial, and one of the challenges has been who is this for? So it happens to be a city initiative. Um, it grows out of the city's cultural plan. The mayor, Rahm Emanuel himself, was heavily involved. Um, and it's been a challenge to balance this question. So there was certainly a desire to put Chicago, not to put it has long been on the international stage of architecture, but for many reasons that people necessarily don't want to talk about. In recent years, it hasn't been perceived as kind of at the cutting edge of architectural thinking. Perceived and reality can be different things, but it wasn't necessarily on the forefront of people's minds. And so, so there is this desire to insert the city on a global stage at parity with some other cities that are hosting architectural conversations through the kind of platform of a biennial. So Venice being the primary one. Being that platform brings, there's architects that are showing at biennials and publishing at a very high level, and a kind of dialogue at a very high level that's happening, and a concern about a disconnect between that kind of global conversation and what's happening on the ground. Because it's a commissioned, curated event, not everyone from the world, or not even everyone from Chicago, is on display. So a question is raised: well, how does this serve local architects? And so I think it's a work in progress. A lot of it has come around education. A lot of the answers to that question is, how does bringing these global architects serve not just architects, but actually people that aren't architects yet, high school students or college students? How does exposing them to a global high quality exchange in architecture put Chicago 10 years from now on a stage in a way that we can't even imagine? And then for practitioners, how does the city, how does activating the whole city of Chicago by bringing global attention to it actually benefit them? Because they may not be in the show, but they are building architecture in Chicago all the time. And if the world isn't paying attention to them for whatever reasons, which may have nothing to do with their quality and more to do with media and certain, historical structures of, where art and architecture publications are in New York or Europe, they were flying over Chicago. So how does getting this attention through tapping into a global network get people to a corner where Chicago architects are building, to see architecture in a new way? How does it inspire clients who may not have been hiring Chicago architects, who may have had to go to China or other parts of the world to build, to build sort of commercial projects, to have more challenging artistic cultural commissions right at home? So at any rate, these are things I'm grappling with. I don't have the answers to, but very sensitive to the idea, to the ideas that you're all exploring, and look forward to seeing how you ultimately grapple with them. And I will certainly give you all written feedback. And thank you for being part of the course. Good luck.